Okay, thank you very much. So, I thought what I would do is, I have a few related papers on this. I thought what I was just going to quickly review a couple ideas from some of my papers and then just present, a few statistics about NBER working papers that have been sitting around on my hard drive for a number of years that had never fit into any paper, and so I thought this was a great place to give some of those. So, and I guess sort of the main theme I wanted to stress at the beginning is that, one might question why is it that this NBER working paper phenomenon has continued to grow and have so many working papers put out when, in the 1970s, NBR working papers served a real purpose you could identify, which is you needed to get your papers to people so they could read them, and if you put a little yellow cover on them and then stuck them in the mail to 800 institutions and you gave the author 50 free copies, that was a way to get your paper out to people. That no longer exists. Your paper is on your own website at the same time it's on the NBR website, so why is it that this institution has continued to grow? So anyway, a couple ideas. I think the main focus I have is that, the reason NBR papers have continued to grow is because our publication process has gotten worse and worse, and in some sense the NBER working papers are a substitute for the publication process and do what the publication process used to do in economics. So I'm going to talk about two changes, one that it's gotten much slower, and the other is that journals also are no longer directing what people read. So the first, this slowdown fact, so I have my 2002 JP paper, also known as NBER Working Paper 7804. I noted that if you look at one measure of how long it takes to publish an economics paper, the time from when you submit a paper to when it finally gets accepted has grown over the last 30 years. And I know someone has extended some of these series out, and I couldn't find it yesterday when I was looking for this. But roughly it went from 9 months back in 1970 to 2+ years by the year 2000. And I hoped in writing about this that the series would then turn down, and that has not happened. So it still takes 2 years to get a paper published. But what's also important is it doesn't take 2 years to get a paper published. It takes 2 years to get a paper published at the journal that accepts your paper. So then there's another trend. This one I took from Card Della Vigna NBR Working Paper 18665. This chart shows you a graph of number of papers accepted at top journals divided by number of papers submitted on average in the previous 2 years of those journals. So you can think of this as a measure of acceptance rate at top journals. And what you'll notice is this is 1980 to 2013. 1980, those numbers around 15% or so acceptance rates. 2013, that's maybe like 7% acceptance rate at top journals. When you think about it, if every paper is a 7% chance of getting accepted, that means you need to do 14 submissions on average before your paper gets accepted. 14 times 6 months is 7 years plus the 2 years. So that would sort of say that it takes 9 years for papers to get published. And the situation is not that bad yet because many people sort of work their way down to easier to publish journals. But it's still, I think the typical time, you take the time lag in between journals, it's many, many years before any paper gets published. What does this mean? One is people say, well, you can't publish anything on a topical issue because if you're trying to write about some recent development, it's going to be 5 years old by the time your paper is going to get published in a journal. But then it also means that even on non-topical things, even if you're just sort of, you're not working on a public policy issue, you're working on theoretical econometrics, if you're basing what you're doing off what was in the journal, what was in the recent journal articles, that's what people were doing 5 years from now, you're 5 years behind the rest of the literature. You can't read those papers to sort of keep up with the field. So, what do we need? We need something you can read more quickly. NBER papers are something you can read more quickly, that someone has just written this paper. What have people written? Either if I'm interested in the topic, I want something recent on the topic, or if I'm interested in just where is this literature because I want to work on that literature. Second thing I wanted to talk about is another paper I have. This is NBER Working Paper 13272. I argued that it seems like journals are doing less to affect what people read in the profession. This paper had a few different facts put together. One fact was that if you look at economists at top departments, they're publishing less, and they're both publishing less in absolute numbers, and they're a much smaller share of the field journals than they used to be. Second fact is that if you look at people at Harvard, it's not just the top journals they don't publish anymore. They don't publish in not only field journals, the top general interest journals, people from Harvard also don't publish as much in anymore. Simultaneously, while that's going on, though, people at Harvard, they're not publishing in journals, but they are being very widely cited. And they're actually doing better than the other top departments on that metric. And then another thing is if you run like paper-level citation regressions, you'll notice that once you condition on the author being famous, the journal that a paper is published in, the journal matters less for the citations. It used to be if you were at Harvard and you published in a second-tier journal instead of in the AER, you'd lose 70% of your citations, and it seems like now maybe you only lose 30% of your citations by publishing in a lower-ranked journal. And I guess what ties these facts together, what I argue ties these facts together is a model to think about this is just that the journals are just not so important in determining what people read. And there's people who need to publish in the journals because you need to publish in journals to get tenure and to, get promotions and to get hired, to get jobs in the first place. But increasingly, sort of not publishing is a good alternative because you just, it's many people, their name can get them the attention to the paper. So, you need their name. Well, you don't just need your name. You need your name, and you need someone to know that you have a paper. And how do people know that you have a paper? You can publish in the NBR Working Paper series. The NBR Working Paper sends out 25,000 emails. Sometimes it's those 25,000 emails that may be sort of a big part of what the NBER is doing. And obviously there are other institutions. SSRN is trying to do this, but the problem with SSRN is SSRN has too many emails. SSRN has so many emails that people stop reading the emails and finding out what people have written. So the people who are fortunate enough to be able to publish in the NBER series, they can be in sort of a smaller, more selective email. That's the way to do it. The NBR also is very good at sending out emails not just to economists, but to members of the media, and so you can be in newspapers and other things for having been in an NBR working paper. So I figured I'd have some data. What are facts that I knew? Now, these are not facts that I updated because these are facts that have been sitting around on my hard disk that I never published. One thing that I did in looking at the 1990s is at one point I'd looked at what share of papers were NBER working papers and how does this compare. And even by the 90s, when there were many fewer NBER working papers than they are now, NBER working papers had a fairly substantial share of a number of journals. So you can see I counted 22% of AER publications had been NBER working papers, 36% of QJE papers, 19% of JPE papers. Those are big numbers, especially when you consider that, right in AER, half the papers are theoretical. And so, or half the papers were theoretical. Now it's probably more like 35 or 40% are theoretical. But, 22 out of 48 means almost like, half the empirical papers. The majority of the empirical papers in the QJE were NBER working papers that became QJE papers. But another thing you do see in this chart is that, right, the NBER, I don't know if it's changed, but the NBER is not everything in the profession. The NBER had 5% of econometrica papers had been NBER working papers, 7% of review of economic studies papers, and so it's a question of, NBER expansion. I think it's something the NBER has to decide is, does the NBER want to cover the whole of the profession, or does the NBER want to be sort of very big and very important in parts of the profession? And I guess that's sort of a, NBER policy issue of sort of what areas do they want to cover, what areas do they not want to cover. Obviously, you run into this problem if you become too big, you become SSRN, and then no one reads your emails anymore. And so it's a question of, is there an optimal scale for the NBER? How selective does the NBER, sometimes, the NBER is like what journals used to be, that they are being selective, and that's what gets people to pay attention, but how selective do you want to be? Another fact about NBER papers is, at least in the 1990s, NBER working papers are very influential. They're very well cited. When I talk about well cited here, also, I'm only talking about citations to the published papers, not citations to the NBER working paper. But so I did run a new regression yesterday. So regressing the number of citations that a paper got on a number of explanatory variables. For those of you who haven't seen a citation regression before, many, many, many things are significant in citation regression. The things that ought to be significant are the journal in which the paper is published, the order in which the paper appears in the table of contents, because editors often put the better papers earlier in the issue, the length of the paper, editors give more space to papers they think are more important. And then many things like how famous the author is, like how many publications the author has in recent years, what institution the author is from. All of those things help predict citations, but then you put them in, and let me say, NBER citations also matter too. I thought, again, people in the NBER like stata output, so I just copied my stata output. It was the cheapest way to make up a table with this many variables. But you'll see that, the order matters. You get a 0.2 2 coefficient out with a t-statistic of 6. You know, the page length gets a t-statistic of 7. The past 5 variable, that's telling you every extra paper you have in the top 5 journals in the last 5 years, that adds 6% to your citations for each additional paper. That's more of the well-known people get cited more. The affiliation variable would say that people at Harvard or top journals or top schools are 20% more cited than other people controlling for the journal and where the editor put it. But then the NBER effect there is NBER papers are 37% more cited than the average paper in that spot, in that journal, even controlling for the author's recent publication record and the author's institution. And you'll see I've got 12 different field dummies down there controlling for international finance and development and labor and PF and whatever. So with lots and lots of controls, NBER papers are more influential. If you want to also ask where does it come from the QJ, I think is always a thing you want to do with the NBER. And the answer here is no. Like the NBER QJ interaction is negative, not quite significant, but sort of say in the QJ, the NBER papers are only about 10% more widely cited. But it's in the other top journals that NBER papers get a lot of citations. Again, data from the 1990s, not totally up to date, but that's what I had. Thank you.
Thank you.